Ladies and gentlemen, would you please take your seats? You're up, Governor.
Thank you very much. Our panel is going to discuss what I think is one of the greatest examples of the power of presidential leadership. Our country talks a lot about the difficulties we have today in getting things done. I'm a great believer that nothing gets done unless presidents lead. And I had the great privilege to work for a president that 10 times a day reminded the chief of staff that things had to get done and go do them. To set the stage for this discussion, let me remind you that in 1989, 1990, the country was having financial problems. It was drifting into recession. It had had huge deficits. The financial community knew that the United States needed a multi-year budget agreement, and it was pretty clear that this was going to be a strong, tough, hard battle between the executive branch and the legislative branch. George Bush understood this, and his message basically to those of us who had to go out and help get this done was go get a budget. There's one person who's not here today. He passed away, Dick Darman. But I have to tell you that George Bush had the benefit in Dick Darman of somebody who understood budgets and process as well as anyone. Now, having said that, I am thrilled that those gentlemen that are sitting here with me today were part of that process. It made a difference. The country got a budget. The country got a budget and budget rules, and the country got a budget and budget rules that cut spending, reduced the deficit by $500 billion, and began this country on a path to a surplus. And it only happens because the president said, go get it done. Let me introduce the first speaker, Bill Hoagland. Bill was the senior Republican staffer on the Senate Budget Committee, worked very closely with Senator Domenici, who was a key part of trying to get all this done. But of all of us on the panel right now, the only one that really understands the arcane details of how to put those things together and make them work is Bill Hoagland. Bill?
I don't believe that, Governor, but okay. First of all, let me just say it's really a very distinct honor for me to be here, a lowly former Senate staffer to participate in this anniversary event for President Bush. At the time, as the governor said, of the budget agreement in 1990, I was the staff director, Republican staff director on the Senate Budget Committee, chaired by Senator Pete Domenici. I was working with Senator Pete Domenici, as well as, of course, the Majority Leader Bob Dole in the Senate. Governor Sununu asked us to have some recollections about what went on, and then to particularly focus on the outcome, the results, and the process. So I have a quick recollection, and this may sound odd and out of place here, but it relates. It's about John, and it's not Governor John Sununu. In fact, I don't even know John's last name. During the heated discussions we were having out at Andrews Air Force Base, a letter arrived that was distributed simply signed John, and it addressed Dear Congressman. And it was read out loud. I think it was Senator Phil Graham who read it out loud, provided a little bit of levity in the midst of what was an extremely serious discussion about spending and taxes. Somehow, I have found in my faded files the letter. Let me just you'll get a gist of it pretty quickly. Dear Congressman, my name is John. I am a warehouseman at a local company, and my wife works part-time at a daycare center. Together we take home not much more than $1,000 a month. I used to be a farmer. I am 56 years old with a high school education. We budget our money carefully and usually spend no more than $50 a month on beer. At current prices, that is 3 cases of beer per month. If you raise the tax $1 a six-pack, we will only be able to buy 2 cases of beer a month. That will be bad, and here's why. My wife is more fun, if you get what I mean, when she drinks 3 beers. It goes on from there, and I will. It ends by, please, Congressman, believe me when I tell you, 3 cases of beer are a lot more fun than 2. Don't raise taxes. Now to the substance of the negotiations. I mean, the president was quoted at the time in early 1990. He said, if I didn't have this budget problem hanging over my head, I would be loving this job. Let's be honest, serious budgeting is hell on politicians' careers and, of course, presidents. The 1990 negotiations on the budget really began long before Andrews Air Force Base in September, and it was backed up against, once again, the usual government shutdown at the end of September. The negotiations, as the governor has already indicated, were driven by a weakening economy in 1990 and the S&L and the banking crisis. And importantly, I believe the negotiations were driven by a combined threats on 2 fronts. The first was here at home with a threat of an across-the-board reductions in spending, and not to get into all the budget jargon here, but it's Graham-Rudman haulings. And we were going to be facing something like about a 34-35% across-the-board reductions in defense spending at about the same time on August the 2nd when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on the second threat. In the end, the president, from my perspective, his leadership and his flexibility in negotiating with a democratically controlled Congress, and I should say another person who's not here with us is Speaker Foley, who was critical and had a good relationship with the president. All that relationship, that working together, brought about, from my perspective, the 1990 budget agreement. And unquestionably, looking back on it today, it's easier to look back than it was at the time. It really was a seminal accomplishment in terms of size, composition, and procedural importance. Green eye shade folks who will carefully examine that agreement today, I think they will find that the outcome from those long days of debate resulted in what was the largest of the multi-year deficit reduction packages enacted in the 1990s, no matter how you calculate that, either in absolute terms or relative to the size of the economy. It was a serious deficit reduction package. As the governor indicated, it was $500 billion over 5 years. It was a compromise, $2 in spending cuts for every $1 in revenues that were raised. Yes, the deficit did increase those years afterwards, but it had nothing to do with the agreement. It had to do with what we in the budget world call automatic statement. The economy weakened and expenditures went up but the deficit would have been $500 billion higher had it not been for that agreement. It was bigger than the 1993 budget agreement that was struck with the Democrats' control with no Republican support, which was quite the opposite of the 1990. It had $2 in revenue increases for every $1 in spending cuts. And it was even larger than the 1997 balanced budget agreement. But more importantly, the fact that the federal government, and I think the governor's already mentioned it, finally reached a balanced budget nearly 30 years, after 30 years in 1998 on a watch by another President Bush, I argue is largely due to the 1990 agreement that set in place procedures for the enforcement of budget discipline. The Budget Enforcement Act, those procedures crafted by Dick Darman, Leon Panetta, Congressman Frenzel, congressional leaders, in the 1990s, those procedures addressed all the failings of Graham-Rudman haulings with strict annual spending caps on discretionary spending, and these are words that budgeteers use, and something called pay-as-you-go on revenues and entitlements. And those procedures are still in effect today. And none of this would have been possible had it not been for President Bush and his leadership. But he did, it's clear, he made a major shift in his campaign promise, and the political risks were real, and they were exploited, I would say, by House Minority Whip Newt Gingrich. On a personal note, I've spent nearly 33 years staffing and working with these fine congressmen and members and senators and government, and began service at the Congressional Budget Office when it was established in 1974. And I have concluded it's a lot easier to be partisan than it is to be bipartisan. And nothing at all wrong with fighting for what you believe in and believing to take partisan positions when you have to. But in the end, sometimes for the greater good, compromise and bipartisanship is necessary to resolve not only divisive budget issues, but indeed most of the policy issues that confront this country today.
Thank you, Bill. Bill has touched on the key to making things work in this country is that our political leaders who come with a partisan and philosophical perspective sit down and come together on an agreement that doesn't satisfy 100% either side. And I think through this whole process, going through the budget, there were a lot of actors with different perspectives on how to get that done. One of the individuals that made a huge difference was the leading Republican on the House Budget Committee, someone who understood the details of the budget, and someone who had enough respect amongst his colleagues to be able to get people that might be reluctant to support a compromise to come along, and that's former Congressman Bill Frenzel. Bill?
Thank you, John. Mrs. Bush and friends of the Bushes, it's a real delight to be here. I've always considered Bush 41 to be my president, and it is always wonderful to be among his friends, and I'm grateful that I have been included. John said I knew what was in the budget. That's why I cried a lot. As Bill Hoagland pointed out, it was obvious at the beginning of 1990 that the 91 budget was a bone of contention. Democrats and Republicans had greatly differing ideas on how it should be handled. And as Bill also mentioned, the president decided that he would negotiate with the Democrat Congress over the budget. And when he made that decision, it did reflect on a campaign promise. It raised the T word and scared a lot of Republicans to death. As Bill also mentioned, the negotiations began, I think, sometime in May. And I'll let somebody correct that if we want to. So the negotiations extended about 6 months. And that's part of the problem that we came upon at the end of the program. The administration's and at least some of my interests lay heavily in the budget process restrictions by which we hoped to contain spending and deficits over the years. And obviously others wanted more spending, and obviously others wanted less spending. And it was just a very long and very involved process. You had Democrats in the House. You had Democrats in the Senate. You had groups within each of those. Then you had to take care of the Republicans in the Senate. You didn't have to worry much about the Republicans in the House because they didn't count much. but we tried to stay involved. After the August recess, after Labor Day, because the negotiations were going so slowly, it was thought that they should be moved to Andrews Air Force Base, a remote location where there were no newspaper people, no lobbyists, no anybody around. That was very nice, but it didn't speed the negotiations up. And of course, sometime thereafter, Saddam Hussein began to be much more evident in his misbehavior, and things got very difficult. But the net of it was that they came to a negotiated conclusion, which I thought was just wonderful, and which the House rejected by a majority of Republicans and a majority of Democrats. In other words, the leadership in the House, which negotiated the agreement on both sides, were not followed by the followership, and the bill went down. That, to me, was absolutely, I don't know about Democrats. For Republicans, it was double-crossing their president. He had negotiated what I thought was a reasonable agreement, and they let him hang out to dry, and they had to go back to the drawing boards. Darman and Sununu had to go back to work, put away their cigars and their scotch and sodas and do some more negotiating. And another bill was brought up, not as attractive to Republicans because Republicans didn't have the votes, but still, as Bill points out, an important improvement in budget process. To me, the 2 points that Bill mentioned, the discrete domestic spending caps and the pay-goes, have been the only budget process restrictions that have done any good in holding down spending or trying to hold down the deficits. And those set the stage for the successor Clinton administration. They didn't do it all, of course. There were lots of other things happening, including things that administration did. But they helped greatly in the 4 years of black ink that the Clinton administration showed in its last 4 years. It was really an important event. The much touted Graham-Rudman's-Hollings never really did accomplish much. It was a threat, but the Congress is very resistant to threats and can seem to be able to sidestep them very well. So here you have Sununu and Darman and Bush putting together, I think, this important budget bill, which saved the country a good deal of money, and as Bill points out, is still, although often honored in the breach, in use and is a threat for what is going on today. Every kind of budget process change or improvement that's suggested always includes those 2 key points. And I think probably the highlight of the negotiation was when OMB Director Darman had to sit down with the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Senator Byrd, to hash out the limitations on the discretionary spending. And I'm glad that I didn't have to sit through any of those meetings. Nevertheless, even though it was the second best shot, I think the BEA 90 is a landmark and the most important thing that we've done in budgeting since the '74 Act was written. And for that, the Bush administration and the people who participated ought to be congratulated.
as Congressman Frenzel has pointed out, what was actually passed was a second version. And before I get to someone who was a principal drafter of much of what was in that second version, let me try and remind you of the political situation the president found himself in after the first package was turned down. First of all, the package the president agreed to met all of the criteria that had been established by the Republican leadership in the Senate and the Republican leadership in the House. And the Senate had, in essence, deferred to Phil Gramm, Senator Gramm, to be their, if you will, final filter on the validity of what was passed. And the House had passed some of that responsibility to Newt Gingrich. Newt had come in with a set of criteria, both verbally and written, and it primarily focused on the fact that there should be no increase in the tax rates to individuals. And the first package met that criteria. In fact, the principal tax in the first package was just a gasoline tax. I say just a gasoline tax because amongst tax purists, the consumption taxes are the least evil from their perception. So the president agreed to a package that met all the criteria that had been established. And he had been able, over that 5.5-month period, to be able to drive everybody to work to a consensus. But Gingrich decided after the package had been agreed to, after everybody had been called to the White House for a celebratory meeting, he decided not to participate in the process, gathered enough Republican votes to have it turned down. One of the congressmen on the Democratic side that voted against it was Congressman Obey. Congressman Obey was chairman of one of the subcommittees on the Appropriations Committee at that time. He later on went on to be chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the House, but what was certainly one of Tom Foley's key people in understanding what happened. So Dave, maybe you can explain to us how we went from package A to package B and why.
Absolutely. First of all, let me say that I am pleased to be here, and I'm almost as pleased as I was surprised to be asked. My wife and I were sitting on a beach in Florida when my cell phone rang, which drove her crazy. And I picked up the phone, and in his most cuddly tones, I heard the voice of John Sununu on the phone. And he told me that we were having the celebration and asked if I would come, and I was delighted to, because I've always had a very high regard for the president. I was sworn in as a new member of the House of Representatives 45 years ago today, and I served until 3 years ago. And when I walked into that house 45 years ago, my best friend of anybody in the house was a young Republican member by the name of Bill Steiger. And Bill Steiger, you bet. Bill and I had gone to college together. We had served in the legislature together, and we served in the Congress until he died at an unfortunately early age. And I remember in those days when Bill was explaining Washington to me, he one day started talking about who he thought would be the top leaders of his party over the next 10 years. And he said, and it proved to be correct, he said, the best we've got is George Bush. And I think there are a lot of people in Washington who worked with President Bush who felt that way over the years. And I say that not just because of the leadership that he showed on this budget deal that we're talking about, but also because I was chairing the Foreign Operations Subcommittee during those years. We worked very closely with the Bush administration on the fall of the Eastern European countries, helping move them from centrally controlled Marxist economies into more market-oriented democracies. We worked closely with him on the Middle East. We backed every play he made in the Middle East, and that took courage on his part. And even on the war in Iraq, where I differed with the president, he was masterful in the way he consulted even people who he knew disagreed, so that he made everybody feel like you were part of the process. And that is so crucial in any issue in politics. You have to feel, even if you are 100% opposed to what somebody is doing, you have to have the remnants of a relationship that can get you to the next issue and the next problem. And so I'm very pleased to be here to explain what the governor wants me to explain. Understand, you cannot understand that budget deal unless you understand the context in which it was struck. Because we had gone for 10 years with big promises, with economic assumptions that were outlandishly optimistic, and we had seen promise after promise in procedural terms turn into dust when it came to producing substantive deficit reduction. And so everyone was suspicious of any new procedural changes. And we also had very little faith that in fact we would wind up reaching deficit reduction targets that were set out. That's what happened when the Andrews Air Force Base deal came to the House. It also occurred in economic terms because we'd gone through at least a 15-year period where the gap in income across the country was growing. And so there were a lot of us who wanted to see a budget deal that would reflect that realization as well. And the reason that went down in the first instance when it came from Andrews is because Newt Gingrich rounded up Republican votes to kill it. And ordinarily he would not have had enough votes to do that. But George Miller, Byron Dorgan, and I were the three people who I think raised most objections to the package as it came out of Andrews. Largely, I'm going to do a Ross Perot by using an old chart, which I dug this out of my files from 1990. This top chart, you can't see it back there, I know, but it separates the population by income. And it shows what the relative impact was on different income brackets of that package. And we felt that because it relied too heavily on increasing the burden for those at the very bottom, we were uncomfortable with it and voted no. The deal that finally passed looked like this on the bottom. As you can see, the larger burden had been shifted to higher income groups. And that made the difference as far as we were concerned. And so we wound up, as Bill said, having a product which was somewhat more palatable to Democrats. And I guess it was the price that Newt paid for being wrong in opposing the president, because the president had told him that he was going to get a worse deal than he would get if he voted for the first package, and that proved to be correct. When we voted against that package, Tom Foley almost skinned us alive. He was furious with us because everybody had put a lot of work into that package. And he let us know how he felt. And I thought that he would never speak to us again, but in a house like that, you always need somebody's vote, and so whether he wanted to or not, he had to come back to us from time to time. But the reason that deal got put together in the end, after that adjustment, is because you had in President Bush and you had in Speaker Foley two people who felt that what you were supposed to do with problems was solve them rather than exploit them. And my major professor in college was a man by the name of Ralph Hewitt from Fort Worth, Texas, who worked for LBJ and then worked for several others. And he always taught us in our political science classes that the job of a politician is first to define differences between the parties so that the public knows where you're coming from. But then the second obligation, after you've defined those differences, is to resolve them. And the problem is that today, there are an awful lot of politicians who are very good at defining differences, not quite so good at resolving them. And if we've got to restore that balance. So I think that's the main reason why the bill went down. That's also the main reason why after it was adjusted, it passed. And I would simply say this. It would be immeasurably more difficult today to do what President Bush did in those days, because not only has the politics of the country changed, but the public has changed as well. There's one question that defines it, I think, more clearly than anything I know. 25 years ago, the year that the president became president, Gallup did a poll, and there was one question in that poll which said, which asked, do you believe that the government has an obligation to help people who can't help themselves? And 25 years ago, 79% of Democrats responded yes to that question, and 62% of Republicans in the country responded yes to that question. Today, the same question was asked 2 years ago, and Democratic support had dropped by 4 points from 79 to 75%. And Republican support in the general population has dropped from 62% to 40%. That's a huge gap, and I think it helps to explain why the polarization in this country is not just in Washington, but it also seems to be around the country as well. And that I think that polarization would have made it much more difficult to do what was done in those years. We were very lucky because we had 10 years of people being frustrated about not producing any deficit reduction that was real. And we were very lucky to have in the White House and in the speakership people who were determined to do something about it. Yes, there were procedural changes and they were important. But in the end, what counts more than anything else in politics, in my view, is human determination. And that's what you had on both ends of of Pennsylvania Avenue. I know at the time there were critics of the president's action, but I think the best answer to that criticism was found in a comment that George Bernard Shaw made once upon hearing that the Honorable Joseph Burgess, Member of Parliament in Britain, had given up his seat in the House rather than compromise on an important issue. And here's what Shaw said: "When I think of my own character, smirched with compromise, rotted with opportunism, mildewed by expediency, dragged through the mud of borough council and Battersea elections, stretched out of shape with wire pulling, putrefied by permeation, worn out by 25 years pushing to gain an inch here or straining to stem a backrush, I do think Joe might have put up with just a speck or two on those white robes of his for the sake of the millions of poor devils who cannot afford any character at all because they have no friend in Parliament. Oh, these moral dandies, these spiritual toffs, these superior persons. Who is Joe anyhow that he should not risk his soul occasionally like the rest of us?"
You know, Congressman Obey makes a very important point that is a lesson for today, and that is when groups come together, and in politics it's the Republicans and the Democrats, and craft out a proposal that is very good for both sides. When some of the purists on either side undermine that process, they invariably end up with something which is even worse according to their own pure standards. And that's what happened here. Tom Foley was mentioned. Tom Foley, this is sort of a reprise of something that we did about a year and a half ago on C-SPAN, on a panel sponsored by the Bipartisan Committee in Washington. And for those of you that have an interest in this, it goes a lot longer than this, but it's a very nice presentation of how cooperation between the two parties can produce good results. And in that, Tom Foley was very gracious in his comments about George Bush and talking about the relationship that they had between them that made such a big difference. Bill Frenzel, let me ask you, you were sitting in the middle of this Republican caucus when the Gingrich defection took place. Can you talk a little bit about what went on there?
Actually, I wasn't. We were mostly, those of us on the conference committee were mostly involved in the negotiations. When the bill popped, it came out. My impression was, however, that the problem with Republicans was boredom. For 6 months, the House had done nothing. For 6 weeks, we were sitting out at Andrews Air Force Base, and everybody was back at the Capitol doing crossword puzzles or whatever it was, and they just had a lot of nervous energy. It's like when you don't walk the dog sneaks out and it's gone for a couple days. Well, these dogs were bored, and off they went. And Newt is usually given credit for being the ringleader. My own personal thought is that he went along because he saw a movement going that he could tie himself to.
Was he leading from behind?
He was a fast follower, I think. It's hard to say, but I believe it was the younger Republicans, a fairly substantial anti-tax group, and it just bubbled around. They got bored enough and talking to each other, patting each other on the back. Pretty soon they believed that they were right. And all that happened so quickly that Bob Michael and I were totally taken by surprise. And there was another great man who worked in that conference and worked awfully hard.
Bill, one of the important things in the budget was the discretionary caps. Do you remember the story about Darman going in and finally negotiating them with Senator Byrd, and how Senator Byrd agreed to have such strong...
My recollection on that was that Senator Byrd had concerns about the caps, as every appropriator would, that you were putting restriction upon appropriations future. But he would agree to the caps on the basis that the flip side of the budget, which has to do with the entitlements, so long as if you were going to put a cap on spending there, you had to also control entitlement spending by either, if you're going to increase entitlement spending, you had to increase taxes to pay for it, or if you cut other entitlements to pay for a tax increase or tax reduction. So he would agree to it. The second thing he wanted very much, and this one sticks in my mind, he wanted some emergency. After all, Saddam had just moved into Kuwait. He wanted some form of an emergency adjustment outside of the caps in the case for disasters. Now, Congress played with that exclusion by, we knew the decennial census was coming, but somehow it was an emergency, so we added money to pay for the decennial census on top of it. But the bottom line was, so long as that we paid for entitlements or reduced or paid for reductions in taxes by cutting other entitlement spending, and so long as there was a provision to allow for spending in case of an emergency, a true emergency. And Dick Darman, I think, negotiated very clearly what the terms of the emergency would be that would allow for an adjustment to the appropriation caps. Those two, you're getting there, I think.
If I can add, he also set the caps pretty high. because they didn't begin to bite until several years out. And so he took care of the next couple of years pretty well for himself.
Let me digress just a hair from the topic at hand, because I'd like to go back to something that I talked about a little bit in my introduction, because I really think it's a very important part of this whole weekend. And that is to put the whole Bush domestic and economic policy package forth as really more than just 1, 2, or 3 pieces of legislation, but a complete package in which a president of the United States came to office with an agenda in mind and got virtually all of that agenda put together. And let me repeat again the list of legislation that George Bush was able to get passed in a Congress that was 252 Democrats to 182 Republicans, a margin of 70, and a Senate that was 55 Democrats to 45 Republicans. He got this budget, which truly was the key to bringing sanity to the system, to getting the Federal Reserve. Without a budget like that, the Federal Reserve would have continued to squeeze the money supply, and the slight recession the country had then would have been a serious recession, and created the incentive for the growth period that followed. So first of all, this president sacrificed his political capital on getting a budget. The second thing that happened is that less than a week into office, we discovered there was a huge savings and loan crisis. And within 30 days, President Bush was able to bring the executive branch together, send to Congress a piece of legislation, and get Congress, a Congress with huge numbers against on a party basis, to pass legislation within 30 days after he sent it up to take care of the savings and loan crisis. The next panel you're going to hear is going to talk about the Clean Air Bill. For 13 years, Congress had been stymied in trying to get a piece of clean air legislation through. George Bush came in, took a novel approach which was market-based, and was able to create a coalition between Republicans and Democrats, and got a clean air bill passed based on a new approach which was market effective, cost effective, and is, as I said earlier today, the model for how people look at federal regulation of environmental needs and national regulation of environmental needs across the world. You heard the panel that Boyd and Gray chaired talk about how the Americans with Disabilities Act, that the president constantly drove Boyden and me and others to go and get passed, no matter what we had to do in order to do it, but do it right. That bill is an example across the entire world. The Civil Rights Bill, he actually had to veto one, was the only president to get a civil rights, that vetoed a civil rights bill to have it sustained, and got the Congress to make the changes that had to be made in order to make that a fair and constructive bill. On the energy side, he really championed deregulation in such a way that benefited the entire country, not only then, but is today giving us the dividend in terms of deregulation of electric markets, which allow us, in many cases, to get competitive prices on the electricity we buy. And the deregulation opened up this whole boom in natural gas and oil exploration in the United States that is now being talked about as being the new age for this country. All of those were pieces of legislation that George Bush brought to the table as part of his agenda. Let me tell you one story on one piece of legislation which doesn't get much publicity, but I think is a classic example of the foresight the president had, and that was child care. The president wanted a child care bill that was based on family values, a child care bill that dealt with family needs rather than just built up bureaucracies. And in that process, he found a very willing partner in Dan Rostenkowski, who was chairman of the Ways Committee and Means Committee, and Dan gave the assignment to Tom Downey, who was number 2 for him on that committee. And Tom Downey, a Democrat, would come over and work out with us a child care bill that was based on vouchers. The interesting story about this, and shows that the President of the United States was involved in this process all the way, is that on the night that the voucher bill was going to be part of an amendment to the final budget package that Dave Obey just described that he had been able to recreate. And about 2 in the morning, I was in Tom Foley's office with the Speaker as they were preparing to get all these packages out to the members of the House to vote on the next day. And one of our key folks from OMB came over to me and says, the voucher bill is not in here. And I went to the Speaker and I said, the President of the United States has indicated to me before I came over here that of all these things, I had about 8 or 9 of them on the list, aren't in there, he's going to veto the bill. Well, Tom Foley thought I was bluffing or making it up, and said that he wouldn't believe me that this bill was going to be vetoed just because child care vouchers weren't in it. Well, it was 2:30 in the morning, and I suggested to the Speaker that that was really the case, and if he wanted, I would call the President. Well, Foley said, okay, go ahead and call him. So I picked up the phone and I called the White House, and one of the ushers answered, and I said, you know, I really need to talk to the President. He went over and woke the President up, and the President came to the phone, and I said, Mr. Speaker, would you ask the President whether he's really going to veto this? And Tom Foley did, and I heard him say, yes, Mr. President, yes, Mr. President. Yes, he hung it up. He says, George Bush said he made a promise, he was going to keep the promise, he'll veto it if it's not in there. And he went around and had everybody insert that page, and that's how the voucher program, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important precedents for education in particular, got established as president because George Bush was willing to say, after all we went through on the budget, if they didn't keep the promise, he would veto the bill. And it made a huge, huge difference. One last set of questions to each of the panelists. If you guys had a recommendation on the basis of what we went through 25 years ago to the folks that are trying to do similar things today in terms of a budget, what recommendations would you give them? David, will you start?
Change your attitude. I mean, let me give you one example. Only 3 times in the last 20 years have appropriation bills all been completed by the end of the fiscal year. One of the 3 times was the first year I was chairman of the committee. And that didn't happen because I was so blessed smart. It happened because I became chairman halfway through the session. I immediately went to the ranking Republican, Joe McDade, and I said, Joe, we're never going to agree on the details of what ought to be in all of these 13 bills. But why don't we at least sit down and work out bipartisan allocations to each of the 13 subcommittees, so at least everybody agrees on what the top line is for each of these subcommittees. He said, sure. We did it. It's the only time in the history of the Budget Act when that has happened. And that's why. It wasn't because I was so smart. It was because I had a cooperative member as the ranking member who was willing to put substance ahead of politics. And so I think with any political leader, whether you are president, speaker, or committee chairman, a lot of that goes into determining how well you do is going to be determined by the kind of opposition you have. And so you need to make certain that on both sides you have people who are disposed to solve problems rather than exploit them. That means you have to elect people with the right emotional attitude, and that is evidently much harder to do these days than it was in the past.
Bill?
Yeah, first I want to add to your list NAFTA, which was not passed
That's right.
during the Bush administration, but was completely negotiated, renegotiated by the Clinton administration, and to its great credit, passed by it. But still, an awful lot of work done by Carla and you and George and others on that, and that was an enormous trade bill. It's the model for everything that followed with respect to free trade. How do we get the boys and girls under the dome to play ball? I go back to where you started, John, and that's presidential leadership. Yeah. Now, not being critical, pretty hard to be a leader when there's no followers. And so I can't lay this at the foot of the present president. It's they simply cannot get together, and they have forgotten the word compromise, or they perhaps think it's a contemptible kind of word, but it's what's kept our government going for, except for 1860, for all of the lifetime of our government. And until the members understand that they can't have everything, but they can move the country forward a bit by making an agreement, they're going to stand there and kick each other. Now, there is some hope because we had the Ryan Murray bill, which the Republicans in the House distinguished themselves by giving it about 40 votes and letting the Democrats pass it for them. But at least it was negotiated by the leadership, and so maybe that will be a harbinger of something to follow.
Very, very quick, Governor. I was going to just say the same thing, at least as presidential leadership. You don't establish, I'm looking down here, Senator Simpson, you don't establish a Bowles-Simpson commission and then run away from it. You don't, and then going out on the limb here, I'd kind of like to do something with campaign finance reform, and I'd also like to maybe change the term of office for these fine gentlemen from 2 years to 4 years so they don't have to continually keep running through this exercise. And one last thing, Governor, if I could correct the record just a little bit, if you don't mind, just a little. You said that the only thing was that highway gasoline tax. To John, who wrote the letter, we did raise the beer tax.
Let me close by saying that I really want to affirm my strong thanks to President Bush for giving me the privilege to work for him and to be the recipient of the admonition half a dozen times a day on half a dozen different items, go get it done. It was a great privilege, and I am thrilled. And I want to thank the three members of the panel here who came today and gave us a glimpse into dealing with one of the really tough issues he had to deal with, in which George Bush showed what real presidential leadership's all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.